Alright, so today we're going to have a look at what we might call, say, like an advanced exploded view, a showcase animation, or an assembly animation or something. I'm not really too sure what to call it, but it doesn't matter because it's going to look really cool and be interesting and show off all the little parts of our assembly, how it comes together. This is a desk that I modeled up as a reference for one of my other classes. Just to be clear that I didn't design this. This is based off a Carlo Molino design from, I think, the 60s. Anyway, super cool stuff. Obviously, it's not textured up, but that doesn't matter. Right now and today, we're going to be looking at playing around with curves and keyframes and all that kind of thing, the stuff we do in animation. So there's a good chance we won't even be needing the graph for a lot of this, so let's get into it. What I mean by like a showcase or advanced exploded view is something where we can show all the bits and pieces of our desk, droid, object, assembly, whatever it is, assembling into the final position. So something you might see like on an ad on TV, all the bits of the tech come together and it looks super cool and interesting. And it's about figuring out ways to do that. Now, one way we can go about it is having all these parts start off at weird areas and then trying to position them into the right spot, which I find is really tricky. And what I'm actually going to do, my little secret technique for this, is to keyframe everything where you want it to be at the end. So before we go and move each individual object, what we're going to do is lock in its XYZ position exactly where it is currently. So that means no matter what, at the end of the animation, wherever it starts, if it's out here or way up in the sky, it's going to come down and land exactly where we want it, exactly where we imported it in from another program. So it should work really well. So let's kind of get into it. Right now I have 100 frames down the bottom. That's easy to change through here. I might change it just to like whatever, 150. Sorry, you got to change it through here. And that's our preview window of frames. Because this might actually go on for a bit because there's a lot of components here. I might not do every bit, but we'll start off with some simple stuff. So maybe to start, what we'll do is have the legs come in from maybe one from one side, one from the other side, and start sort of building up around that. Or we could start with the very central components, which are these two supports. So maybe these supports could be floating, or they could appear, or we could have them fade in over time. This is the kind of thing that's going to start making sense as it happens, because it's really kind of hard to visualize. It's like sometimes it's like sketching. You kind of know what you want it to look like, and you just got to do the bits and pieces that make it happen. So this requires some sort of spatial awareness, but really it's just about understanding all these values and these translations. When we turn on our transform, one of the things I have noticed for my other classes as well, if transform isn't showing here, if you don't have a big enough monitor or screen for all these to show up at the top, there'll be a little arrow next to whatever the last one in this section is. So this little section, you can even break it out so you always have it available. It's just, I've had some students who their screens haven't matched up quite to mine, so that's how we'll go about it. So what we want to do, if we're going to move this over in this direction, sorry, there's some sort of thing on the top glass, we don't want that. So we just select that again with our shift key, and we've got all our values here. So when we drag this, we see that the Z translation is moving. So what we're going to do is select the translation in Z, and it really doesn't matter what frame we're at the moment. All I'm going to do is key it, and I can't even see because the zoom on this is messed up, but when we click here and click frame curves in view, we get it to show up. So this is going to be our final position of the leg. I'll just change that to, well, maybe because we want the legs to come in quick, we'll go to frame 25. And what that's done is now move that to frame 25. So what we want to do now is position it off the screen. It doesn't really matter. As you can see, this value's gone up to like 3000. We can still change that again. So we can do it at frame 0 just to make sure we're starting off there. And Z translation, key it again. So this is going to create thing. It's always good to hit that frame curves in view, because the curve always changes when you're adding stuff in. And, you know, we might just round that up to 3000 if I can press the right buttons, because buttons are tricky. And so now that's really simple. Just that comes in and lands in the middle within the first 25 frames. Maybe we even want it quicker. And to really easily edit that, we can click just the leg up here, select the end value and change that. So if we want it to happen by frame 15, boom, frame 15. So I think you can start to see what I mean by working backwards. We can now quickly select the other one. We know it's going to be translation into Z. Select it, key it, roll back to frame 0, push it out, key it. We can see it's over here on frame 0. It's got -1000, so we go -3000. And now that's already set at the exact same distance opposite of that first leg, because we remembered the values, and when we play it, they just smash right in, and that's set. So we can either hide them out of the way or do something like that. Another thing, you know, really obvious, just to stick with the basics, is going to be the tabletop. Maybe we'll have, okay, so something like this where it starts, and if we actually have a look, what it does actually fits in between the holes within these legs. So something like this, because they're not the most attractive sort of pieces, you don't want to just start with them floating. But we might just leave them for now, just because something like that I would maybe have fade into view. We can go over that later or another time. So yeah, another one could be the tabletop. So once the legs are in frame, the top can come down, and that's going to be the same sort of deal. We turn on our curves. Sometimes you have to reselect it once the curves open. This is where it really is beneficial to label your pieces correctly. It doesn't matter what frame we start at. Let's just make sure, yep, we're in the Y. So this has been moved up slightly. It is sitting at 4.7. The reason for that is just because it's a transparent material, and when I catted it up, I originally had it set to 0. And that's where you start to get this weird artifacting. I've probably mentioned it like 30 other times in class. But anything that's transparent and touching another surface, just move it off by about 1. And it should be fine. So I'm just going to key that there at 1, and then come back, change this value to something like whatever. It could be 1000, could be 10,000, doesn't matter. So let's just go 3000 again. That's a nice out of the way number. And frame it, looks fine. We can click all of these at the same time and see that they're all doing the same sort of thing. If we want it to land at the same time, we can change it to the same frame value, but if we want it to land afterwards. So now when we actually do that, if we change our, you can drag the preview shorter, so it actually runs through only partial areas of it. And we can see that the legs come in and the top comes on top. Obviously this is going way too fast. We'll want to slow it down later, but it's just about getting everything in there, which is fine for now. Maybe we might just keep the main sort of box here, because otherwise it's going to really drag on. But we could have something like this actually come from the ground up. It can get a little glitchy if you've got shadows already there and you're trying to animate that. But what we can do, and what we found in the interior class the other day, was that we can get a really interesting sort of effect with this side cladding. And we can play around with multiple objects at once here. So just by going, again, it doesn't matter whichever frame we want to work with here. We come in and find what value changes when we drag it. Now it's probably going to be the X, and yeah, we can see over here that the X values are changing when we drag those across. So what I'm going to do is come through and select all of those on the X. Now this would be a really good time to label your things properly, because I don't know which one's which. But what I'm going to do is key those channels. Now, when I drag them off and move the timeline back to the start or a couple frames earlier, it doesn't matter. Sorry, just drag it out again and key them. What that does, we can have a look and see each individual one has the exact same thing here. We can be a little tricky with that now and offset the frames individually. So let me just check. This one is, okay, so the bottom's number 32. I want the top one to actually come in and land sooner than the other ones. So what I'm going to do is change where this frame is on this first one, and I'll just say frame 0 for that, and you know what, frame 20 for that. So we're going to have a space of 20 frames between them. That's body 34, so that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. So let's just change this one then. 36 frame 0, and then frame 20. 35 is going to go from frame 5 to 25, and so on. So when we do this, this is going to, they're all going to have the same values. They're just going to have a different start and end frame, which means, what am I up to? I'm already losing count. 10 and 30, so 15 and 35. And then this is going to go from 20 to 40. And we can already see that they're staggered out. Now, this looks great that they're not actually in any sort of order. But that actually kind of looks cool. They're in a messed up order. These numbers don't relate to how vertical they are. So when we play this now with those offsets, we can see that they come in and land all at a different time, which starts to look a lot more interesting than a bunch of these just slamming into one spot. So I think, yeah, now we're starting to understand how these can work. This is made up of, well, it's actually made up of a bunch of little boxes and areas. The way I divided that up won't really work for this example because it was done for texturing and not for assembling. So we might actually just leave that for there. But maybe we'll try and do this one in the proper order. So we can do these one by one if we want to make sure we're doing it properly. We select this, we check where it's moving, it's in the Z-axis. So when that's on, yep, that's on, we want to make sure it's on 0 because it's sitting within it. Sometimes these can be a bit tricky to actually just lock in. And key it, come back to frame wherever, key it again, and we can set whatever values we want. It doesn't matter if we drag it out far or drag it out close. It could be 300, it could be 3000, and we can go from frame 20 or frame 40 on this one to frame 60. Oops, sorry, so that should say 0. And that goes to frame 60. This one here, Z-axis. For some reason, these are all sitting within slightly, which could be a problem. Maybe I messed with it earlier, so I'm just going to go ahead and change that. And if the other one was on frame 60, this is going to end at 65. If I key it again, it's going to be 5 less than whatever the other one was. So we can double check. Or 5 more, so 45 to 65 is what we were doing. So we just come in and go 45, change the value to 3000, and so on. So it can be quite confusing and quite simple at the same time. Realistically, we're only changing a few numbers, but we are creating really quite an advanced assembly animation by bringing in all these different elements. And when you start to roll it backwards and forwards like that, it starts to look really cool. So I might just stretch out some of these because this is only happening over the course of a few frames. And when it is happening over a few frames, we start to lose that clarity because it is moving a bit too fast for the frame rate. So what I will do is just slow some of this down. I want the top glass to land at frame 50. I want the legs to finish up their moves at 30. So the legs will still move relatively quick. And each one of these I'll probably extend out by another 20 frames, so 40. And unfortunately you do have to kind of come in and manually edit these when you want. This is why having a good plan of like, I want this to run for however many seconds is probably a good idea. Double check that. Yep, 50, 55, 40, 60. 65, 85. So yeah, it can get confusing when you're trying to play around with all these numbers and make sure everything's in order. So starting off with a properly organized file is the best way to do it. And we can see these are starting to fall together a bit nicer and smoother. It is rendering it out as we do it, so it is actually not running at the full speed as well. So don't be put off too much if it looks a little glitchy. In some parts, you might find that on your thing, when you move the camera around too fast, it's sort of wigs out and lags. But when it comes to rendering out each one of these frames, it should work quite proper. So let's just find... Alright, so at about frame 100 on this, we are sort of fully assembled, and it works like that. You could imagine, and yes, you can just use your imagination for how the rest of this would work, but we want to also mix it up with a some type of like rotation on the camera. So we could have it start in really close and start panning around, or we could come from around the back of this and move out, depending on what you want to focus your scene around. Obviously you don't want these elements showing, so we can do some tricky stuff where these elements are hidden until we actually get around to it. What I'll look at doing first is setting up our camera, and to do that we come down to our animation on our camera setting. We want to pivot around this point we've set, so we can just make sure we control click maybe somewhere in the middle there. We hit the get from view, and what this does, it just positions the turntable settings of our camera around this viewpoint, so we can do full rotations really quite easily, depending on where it is within the whole scene, which is great. It's a really cool way of doing it. So what I'll do is open up our curves. For this we have to select our camera, which means we have to turn on our graph, go to the top, select our perspective camera, and now we've got all these options. We have been over this in another video, so what we have to do is just find our turntable options, which are somewhere here because there's about 1,000 of them. So turntable distance, height, and angle. and we just want to key all of those, and then we can start to play around with how this camera is going to change as we progress through the frames. So if we come to frame 100, we're going to want our camera to maybe be around here. We might want it to be a bit closer and at a lower angle, so we get this cool rotating effect. Then what we have to do is just make sure we've still got these selected and key those channels. So now when we play our animation, we should have, the whole thing starts to assemble in front of us. So, we get these really cool effects, like you can adjust things to be really interesting, like right here, this comes in through the front of it. Maybe we could play around with some of the settings, so as the camera's at this point, the leg goes around and we're going through this little hole in it. It zooms in, and so this is how we can start to get those really slick looking product assembly type things that you'd expect to see on like an ad or something really cool online. Like I did mention as well, there is the option to have things be sort of visible or invisible at a certain point in time. So where's a good example of that? When we move this, where is a good example? So what we might actually do is have we might change this up and bring in our zoom option. So we can start more zoomed in. If we come down to here, one of these is going to be distance, and all we have to do is play around with our distance value. So we could come to like 1000. So we're in here now. And okay, so that actually works as well with the whole camera falling through the middle. We want to see these top ones flying in, but maybe we want the bottom ones to come in afterwards. We just don't want to see them all at the very start. And it can be tricky to kind of get what I mean here, but like right now we're seeing these, and it might just be a matter of having them invisible at the very start of the scene. So we come to frame 0, we select our object, straight up option of visibility, we key it and we key it again, and this one I think it just works on a value of 0 or 1. So when we move across here, this is where we want to first see it in the scene, down in the bottom right there. And we can have it with these other ones that start out there. Maybe we will do it so all of these are invisible until we get to that final bit. That might make it a bit clearer what we're trying to do here. So this middle one comes through first. So what I'll do is have this visible, click it, and we want it to just show up at some point. Let's just say here, and we hit visible. This is going to look a little janky when it just appears. But the idea is that you set up your frames and everything so it's slightly off. And we can see that as we roll out, it just shows up as soon as it hits that frame. And that's how we can get some pretty cool things that start off screen and move on screen really well. What I'll do actually is I'll take off the camera controls and play around with them a bit more here. So what we might want is okay, for something like this, maybe what we would want to do is start on an angle that is facing those. So we might go -180. And we might want to be facing these at the first bit. And then maybe our camera comes down sooner. And after that, that's when these show up. And it's going to be a bit tricky. I might actually have to move them a bit back in the animation. But this should make sense very soon. So if we want our angle to come down a lot lower, we're just going to crank that to -500 maybe. maybe about 700. And we want to start off a lot closer. So we're just going to find this really quickly. Our start is going to be about maybe 500. So we start off here. And we want them to show up maybe around this point where we hit the side. Or even just the very start. So once they're sort of obscured, that's when the top ones come up. It's not the best example, but I can't think of a more interesting way of just showing this sort of visibility thing. It isn't super advanced or anything like that. We're quite literally just changing a number from a 0 to a 1 to make it show up or not show up. So at this point where it's hidden, that's when we would make it visible. So just to show, we're focusing on that second one, and we want to make it invisible up to that point. So we go 0, and we can see it works on a 0 to a 1. So it's invisible, and now it's visible once it passes through that frame. The top one probably won't work as well because it's always partially visible, but we'll go for it anyway. And we'll just pretend as though around about there it's hidden, and we'll just change that to a 0. So it's about having that sort of clean start, and then everything shows up into it. With a bit more planning on a more interesting scene, maybe we'd get something like that happening. But you don't want things starting in the middle of your scene. You want everything to be moving already. But yeah, so I think that's a pretty cool little, not so much basic, but it shows how we can get some really advanced sort of some dynamic elements going when we're showcasing our designs. We want them to look interesting, and we can do all the other stuff as we start to move on. If you've got these all textured up differently, you can play around with textures. So when you select your materials, you've got all the settings here that you have over here. So we could change it that these start off black and become white as time goes on, or we could select the whole even just the R channel, and go frame to frame. And so if we have a look now here, we change it from a value of 1. We can do whatever we want with it. We can see that these numbers are changing there. So we change just the R channel to, where'd that go? Yeah, so we could have it at a 1 there, a 0 there, and let's just see. Oh, okay, that's only a couple frames, that's my bad. So let's just refocus that. Zero. And then we bring it into something like super red or partially red or whatever it may be. You can play around with it that way. Have it come in later, have it come in with the curves. When it starts off negative, it starts off blue. There's all these different ways of playing around with materials and colors, and we can have some real interesting effects as we go through it. Maybe you want to show off what your object looks like in a bunch of different colors, so you can just go through, and like a bit more of a structured way of doing that is we'll delete the RGB values, and at frame 0 we can just select all these, select our material, pick a color we like, let's just say bright green, and then key it at that frame, move forward, doesn't matter what frame it is, open our material again, change it to purple, key M at that frame, move forward, change the color again. Maybe, yeah, we'll go to the red. And then we just come in and keymat that frame. Oh, that screwed up. Well, it does not like the red at this point. Sorry, I didn't have those selected. Let's go there. Oh, well, that's just gone back to purple now, hasn't it? So come across to the red, accept, make sure we've got these selected, then key it. All right. So now we can see as we play through this, the colors go from green to blue, purpley. So we can do all these crazy kooky things with our colors if we want to showcase all of our different, if we have different options for our, whatever our product is. We can go from timber to like a solid color or something like that. But again, this is just about saying there are these different ways we could do it. Now you could go through and showing something like this off. If you're going for that final level, you could ray trace this. An animation like this is going to take a very, very long time to animate properly. Like we're talking, because we've got the glass top, we got the reflections and everything like that. So this would definitely take a few good hours to render out at a high level of quality. But it is totally possible for us to do something like this for our final submissions or whatever it may be. The reflections work excellent when you're looking with ray tracing on. But I think the beauty of VRED is there's still that level of not as much believability, but quality presentation when you don't use the ray tracing. So something like this would still render out relatively fast. So like, you know, I'd be able to render out all the frames for this, these 100 frames, I'd be able to render them out in a couple minutes, whereas using ray tracing, it would definitely take a couple hours. But anyway, that's just a few little tricks I wanted to go over. Hopefully it can maybe encourage you to do some more exploratory things in VRED, come up with some interesting ideas of how you want to showcase your designs, because it is a rendering program, and then, you know, CAD rendering, it tends to drag on and get a bit boring at times. I understand that. So we want to do what we can to try and make it somewhat interesting and new when we're playing around with ideas. And we really can sort of look at pushing the limits of what's expected of us and how you might, show off your designs. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you find it helpful, and I'll catch you all next time.